There you go.
Excellent. So it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Sanford Goldberg, Chester D. Tripp Professor in the Humanities at the Northwestern University, nearby Chicago. Sanford is known for many important contribution books. I just mentioned a few here. Conversational pressure, the Oxford book, handbook of assertion, something very interesting for people like me interested in the speech act theory. Another with a marvelous title, To the Best of Our Knowledge. Excellent title for a book of epistemology. And Foundations and Applications of Social Epistemology. So without more ado, Sanford, I thank you for accepting our invitation, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. I appreciate it. It's my great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay as I speak into my microphone?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
I want to thank you and also thank the organizing committee for inviting me. This would have been significantly more enjoyable, at least for me, if we had been able to do this in person, because Brazil is a country that for me is both fascinating and beautiful and has the most wonderful people. But alas, we're going to have to do this on Zoom. So bear with me as I share my screen. And I am going to put this in the mode where I can present the whole thing. Whoops. Sorry. I am going to, let's see. Okay. Now, this is going to be, please forgive me.
Not your fault.
It surely is my fault. You're being very gracious, but okay. So I want to talk about an act that I'm going to call the act of address, and I'm going to call this talk about the act of address in part because I'm going to try to convince you that addressing another person is a topic that has been seriously under-theorized by us philosophers. I'm going to start off my talk today by telling you what it is to address another person. I'm going to try to convince you that when we give an account of this, we need to give a normative account of this act, and an account in terms of the norms that bear on acts of this type. I'm going to try to advance 4 theses about the nature of address. First, that by addressing you, a speaker gives you a reason to give your attention to them. Second, that this reason is underwritten by what I'm going to call the abiding mutual interest that rational social creatures have for cooperating and hence for coordinating with one another. So those first 2 claims are claims about a kind of reason that is produced in the act of addressing another person. And it's about the nature of that reason. My third thesis is that a speaker who addresses you enjoys a presumption of cooperativity. You should presume that they are being cooperative. And then finally, that presumption, the presumption of cooperativity, can be defeated. And when it is, the speaker has no claim on your attention. So the rough idea here is that to address another person is to lay claim to another person's attention. That idea of laying claim to another person's attention is extraordinarily interesting to me. I think it's a core second personal phenomenon. I'm going to try to explain it in terms of a kind of reason that's produced in the act of addressing another person. And then I'm going to try to suggest that There are cases where even though somebody has addressed you, you don't owe them your attention. And then finally, I'm going to talk a lot about the explanatory power of the model that I'm going to be presenting today. Let's begin by what it is to address another person. And I should say, because I recognize that I am in the position of speaking in a first language that is not first language for many of you, if I am speaking too fast, I would like you simply to interrupt me. And you can do that either by speaking out loud, if you can do that, or by putting something in chat to tell me that I'm speaking too fast. I want to try to make sure that everyone can understand what I'm saying. Okay. I'm going to suggest that the topic of address lies at the intersection of four. Yes. Was there a comment? I thought I missed something. I'm going to suggest that the notion of the topic of address lies at the intersection of four subfields of philosophy. First, philosophy of mind, because it pertains to attention, the attention that we have and the attention that we give to one another, and a kind of attention in which we are attending not just to how the world is, but to one another. Secondly, philosophy of language, and in particular, with a nod of my cap to André Leclerc, the part of philosophy of language that we call speech act theory. Third, it's part of social and political philosophy. This is a curious claim that I hope to convince you of by the end of my talk, that the topic of address has to do with social and political philosophy. And then finally, it has to do with ethics as well. In particular, there is what I'm going to ultimately want to call an ethics of address. So it's an interesting topic, but the reason that I bring it to your attention today is that it is paradigmatically a second personal phenomenon. That is, when I address someone, I address that person as a you, and I want to secure their attention, wherein they address me as a you. So it's fundamentally a second personal phenomenon, and I will try to say what I mean by this in a few moments. What is it to address another person? Let's start with some examples. First, let's consider the call. And by call, I'm using a term that has been used by Quill Kukla and Mark Lance in a very, very influential 2009 book entitled Yo and Lo. Where I talk about address, they talk about calls. What do they mean by calls? They mean things like calling out a person by name. So if I wanted to address Diana, I would say, hey, Diana, and thereby address her by her name. But you can also present a call in other second personal ways. In English, although it is not polite, if you don't know someone's name, you can address them as, hey, you in the corner, you over there wearing the red glasses. That's another way to address a person or to call them without calling them by name. And it is, again, second personal, hey, you. In addition, you can address another person with gestures. And there are lots of gestures that fit the bill. We have waving, flagging another person down while stuck on the side of the road. Notice that white stuff there, that's what we in Chicago call snow, and we are at the point of December where we are actually getting that on the ground right now. I suspect that's not seen very often in Brazil, or at least most parts of Brazil, but we are seeing it now in Chicago. You can also point at someone to address them. This is the ex-governor of New Jersey, who is trying to reconstruct his reputation. I won't talk about him because I don't think he's a particularly pleasant character, but he is pointing at someone, thereby addressing them. You can address someone by beckoning. In bars and pubs, at least in the United States, the way that you can grab the attention of the bartender is by raising your finger. That's a way of addressing someone, and so too by saluting. Saluting is a way of addressing someone. Two other ways that I want to bring to your attention about how we address people. Eye contact. This is a great one. You can address someone simply with your eyes. And there are all sorts of interesting scenarios in which this happens, especially in the movies. Here's a very famous film clip. But this is another way in which you can address someone by maintaining a certain kind of eye contact. And then finally, whistling under certain circumstances can actually be a way in which you address someone. All of these are examples of address. And what they have in common is that they are second personal. That is to say, they are something that a person does with respect to another person when the first person is presenting herself to the other person as, or thinking about the other person as a you, as someone who is standing in a kind of intimacy, an intimate relationship, not an objective relationship, but a relationship that is one involving the intimacy of one person and looking at another. Secondly, these acts have a distinctive aim. Their aim is at capturing the target's attention. This is really important. The aim of an address is to capture the target's attention. But like other things in speech act theory, one performs an act of this kind, aiming to capture the target's attention, with the intention that one be recognized as doing just this. This, if you like, this is a Gricean explicit communicative intention. So the idea is that I not only want to capture your attention, I want you to recognize that that's what I'm doing. And then finally, of course, these addresses can be either linguistic or non-linguistic, and we gave examples of both. If we had to characterize what an address is, rather than just give you examples and various characterizations, how might we characterize this phenomenon? I'm going to suggest that we think of addresses as acts with a particular public significance, so that in order for me to characterize them, I need to present to you an account of what it is for an act to have a public significance, and then what particular public significance is associated with acts of address. So I want to do this right now, first by talking about what it is for an act to have a public significance, and then what particular public significance is associated with the act of address. So forgive me for this long definition, but I'm going to say that an act has a public significance in a given community just in case it's reasonable to regard it as mutually believed in that community that the act would be ascribed a particular significance by a reasonable observer in that community who observes the performance of the act. So this is a mouthful. The idea is that public significance is a matter of a reasonable assumption. And the reasonable assumption is that people around here would regard the act as having a certain significance. That's what it is to have a public significance. Then we can say the public significance of an act in a community just is the significance that the reasonable observer in that community would ascribe to the act. So think of in Evanston, where I live, starting in December, we have on Tuesday mornings, the first Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m., we have a siren that blasts throughout the entire town. It's just that siren is, if you like, it's the emergency system. It's a practice of the emergency system. If it occurs on Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m., everyone in Evanston knows that it's a practice of the emergency system. So it has the public significance of a practice of the emergency system. That's what it is for an act to have a public significance. The public significance of an act of address, then, is that of an act that is targeted at an individual or a group of individuals. It's got a target. Someone or someones are in mind. It's intended to capture the target's attention. That's its aim. Where this attention-capturing intention is in the service of an intention to initiate a possibly minimal joint or cooperative action. That last condition is really important. When I address you, I don't just want to capture your attention. There are all sorts of ways that I can capture your attention. There are all sorts of ways in which I can get you to recognize that I'm trying to capture your attention, but that's not yet to address you. To address you is to capture your intention in such a way that you know that I want to initiate something, some sort of joint or cooperative action with you. Maybe I want to ask you a question. Maybe I want to invite you to dinner. Maybe I want to request that you close the door. But the idea is I'm capturing your attention not just because I can, but for a further purpose, in particular, to propose a joint or cooperative action with you. That's the idea. If all of this is correct, here's a possible analysis of the act of address. To address another person is to perform an act, intending that the act be ascribed the public significance of an act of address by its targets, where this involves the targets ascribing to the act the properties of being targeted at them, being produced with the intention to capture the target's attention, such that attention capture is in the service of an intention to initiate possibly minimal joint or cooperative action. That's a proposed attempt to characterize the act of address. And it fails for an obvious reason. And I say obvious, this will be obvious to any of you who do any speech act theory. I'm going to call this problem the Humpty Dumpty problem. The Humpty Dumpty problem. You will remember from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, this brief conversation that Humpty Dumpty has with Alice. Humpty says to Alice, "When I use a word," Humpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." I think Alice is right. You can't just imbue a word with whatever meaning you want to imbue it with. But for precisely the same reason, you can't imbue your action with whatever public significance you want to imbue it with. On the contrary, you are constrained in how you can act if you want your act to have the public significance of an address. The way to address this is to talk about the need for mutuality and uptake. It may well be that when I address you, I'm putting myself in a position to expect your attention. But the only way I can do that is by acting in such a way that you can expect that my action is reasonably interpreted as a call on your attention. That constrains what I can do to address you. I can't just, as it were, whistle a tune in the intention that you recognize that I'm trying to address you. If I've given you no reason to recognize that's what I'm doing, then that doesn't count as an address. So here we might ask, how then am I going to act if I want to produce an action that I can anticipate will reasonably lead you to regard my action as an address, as having the public significance of an address? The way to do this is to talk about three appearance properties. I need to do something that appears to you to be a case of targeting. I'm targeting you. I need to do something that appears to you to be an attempt to capture your attention. And I need to do something that appears to you to have the intention to initiate a joint or cooperative action. So I need to do something that has certain appearances to you. Apparent targeting, apparent attention capture, apparent intention to initiate joint action. I'm going to call these the appearance properties of an address. And with these in mind, I'm going to give you my final analysis. Here is what it is to address another person. An act is an address when it has the appearance properties of an address. It's performed with the explicit intention that it be ascribed the public significance of an address by its targets, and the appearance properties are explicitly intended to aid the audience in this ascription. That is what an act of address is. Now, for those of you who know your speech act theory, especially for those of you who know your Grice, What I'm really trying to do is model my analysis of address on the model of Grice's account of speaker meaning. An address, you might think, has a kind of speaker meaning. And in order to have a kind of speaker meaning, it needs to be informed by an intention that I expect you to recognize. That's what I'm trying to do here. That's just by way of setting up what we're going to be talking about. I'm talking about acts of that kind. What I now want to do is I want to convince you of my guiding idea. My guiding idea is that the phenomenon of address has an important normative dimension. That is, when I address you or you address me or we address whomever, that act has an important normative dimension. By this I mean that there are norms that govern both the act of address itself as well as one's response to being addressed. There are norms. What this means is that there are standards by which we can evaluate whether you have performed your job well, correctly, in a way that is to be celebrated or is to be discouraged. This is the reason why I think the act of address is a deeply normative phenomenon. I'm going to try to convince you that there are proper ways to address people. And I'm also going to try to convince you that there are proper ways to respond to someone who has addressed you. And all of this turns out to be both more simple and more complicated than you might have imagined. It's more simple in that I think this is a special case of a general feature of human beings. It's a feature of human beings that arises when we think of ourselves as social creatures. But it's more complicated in that it turns out there are lots of details that we need to pay attention to if we are to understand the normative dimension of address. Okay, I begin first with a question. Why do we need an account of the normative dimension of address in the first place? Why if this were a linguistics convention rather than a philosophy convention, I can imagine a linguist in the audience thinking, yes, address is a linguistic phenomenon, but it's an empirical linguistic phenomenon. It's an empirical question how human beings capture the attention of each other. Why in the world is this philosopher suggesting that we characterize this phenomenon normatively? Why not give a purely empirical account of the phenomenon of address? Why do we need an account of the normative dimension of address in the first place? Well, I'm going to suggest that we need to go beyond a merely empirical or non-normative account in order to situate the normativity of address within our other normative commitments. I'm going to suggest to you that there are all sorts of things that we value and disvalue that arise in the course of address, and it's important to situate addresses in a theory of the kinds of things we value. Secondly, I want to suggest that one of the most fascinating things about the act of address is that it's a way to lay claim on another person's attention. It's a way not just to capture somebody's attention, but to lay claim on that attention. That difference is very important to me. I can capture your attention in all sorts of ways. If I make an extremely loud noise, I'm likely to capture your attention. You're likely to attend to me. But it wouldn't be true to say that I deserve your attention or you owe me your attention when I make a loud noise. But I'm going to be suggesting that when I address you, at least under certain further circumstances, you owe it to me to give me your attention. We need to explain that owing it to me to give me your attention. Third, we need a normative account of address in order to explain the ordinary reaction of cases in which another's address fails to capture the addressee's attention. There are all sorts of cases like this. In some of these cases, we will have strong negative reactive attitudes. We will get very upset with the target. In other cases, we won't get upset with the target. In order to make sense of our reactive attitudes in the case of address, we need a normative account of address. Fourth, this is another interesting one. I said to you earlier that there are norms on the speaker. There are proper ways to address others, and there are improper ways to address others. And we often have very highly charged reactive attitudes to the speaker herself when she's addressing someone else. If we're going to make sense of that, we need an account of the normative dimension of address. And then finally, and this is one I confess I haven't thought as much as I should about, we need a normative account of address to illuminate the status of communication that is not face-to-face. If you are neurotic like I am, you might wonder, when somebody emails you, do you owe them a reply? Or is it okay simply to ignore them? I don't worry about this when it comes to my colleagues. With my colleagues, I think I owe them a reply. I worry about this when I get an unsolicited email from someone that is asking me for something that is going to be irksome. Do I owe them a reply? Well, they've addressed me, and in order to know whether I owe them at least a reply, maybe a polite, sorry, I can't do this, we need to understand the normative dimension of address itself. Similarly, with things like Facebook taggings, do you owe a response there? Are Facebook taggings and Twitter taggings, are those even addresses? I think sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. In order to know the proper way to respond to all of these, we need an account of the normative dimension of address. Okay, I want to suggest one other thing. I want to suggest that we need to go beyond the study of address in the various types of speech act. This is important because in the book that I mentioned to you earlier, I think it's the 2009 book by Kukla and Lance called Yo and Lo, they offer an account of what they call calls, each of which is associated with a distinctive speech act. I think that we should give a theory of address that precedes any theory of speech acts. I don't think we should tie a theory of address to a theory of speech acts. And the reason I think that is so that we can generalize over all speech acts that address, and so that we can account for forms of address that don't involve language use at all, and to determine whether the normativity of linguistic address is a special case of a more general normative phenomenon, the normativity of address proper. Okay, with all of this, I can finally get to some theses, and I'm going to try to make sure I leave time for questions as well. Let me see if I can get to some theses now. First, addressing another gives the targets a reason to give you their attention. I'm going to focus on that idea of there being a reason. Second, this reason is underwritten by the abiding mutual interest that rational social creatures have for cooperating and hence coordinating with other rational social creatures. That idea that these reasons are underwritten by a rationale, I want to explore this rationale with you at some length. Third, there's a defeasible presumption of cooperativity of a speaker who addresses us. This idea that we should presume cooperativity strikes me as an extremely important one, and I'll have a chance to talk about this in a few moments. And then finally, this presumption of cooperativity can be defeated, and when it is, the speaker has no claim on your attention. And I'm going to call that defeat, and I'm going to look at several circumstances in which there is defeat of the presumption of cooperativity. Let's start then with reasons. Addressing another gives the targets a reason to give you their attention. Okay, I said to you earlier that there are all sorts of ways that I can capture your attention. If we are in a crowded room and I scream at the top of my lungs, you probably will give me your attention. It's not clear whether you owe it to, in fact, it seems as though you don't owe me your attention, but you might give me your attention. It's not clear whether, having screamed at the top of my lungs, I gave you a reason to give me your attention. Rather, it may just be that I did something that, as a matter of fact, captures your attention. But when it comes to address, there's a reason in play. And in order to get at this, I want to give you a quote from Lance and Kukla, a more recent paper, 2013 paper of theirs, where I think they get this idea exactly right. So here's what Lance and Kukla say in a 2013 paper of theirs. They say, quote, while all calls, think addresses, give their targets reasons to act, different kinds of calls create different kinds of reasons. And these kinds often cannot be understood except in relation to the types of second personal transactions that institute them. So I think this idea is fascinating. What I think that Lance and Kukla have in mind here is that this is the performance of a kind of communicative act whose performance generates reasons for other people to act in certain kinds of ways. To be sure, they think the reasons in question are associated with the various different kinds of calls, the various different kinds of addresses, whereas I want to see the reason as deriving from one source. So I want to see address as an act that generates a reason for the addressee to respond in certain kinds of ways. Why should we think that acts of address generate reasons of this kind? First, to capture the reactive attitudes one has when one's address is ignored. Compare the following two cases. I'm trying to get your attention, and I do so by driving by you very slowly in my fancy new car. Suppose that as I do so, you ignore me entirely. I don't think anybody would have any particular negative reactive attitude towards you if you ignored me under these circumstances. Even if you knew that I was driving by you in my fancy new car in my attempt to get your attention, and even if you knew that that's what I was trying to do and I wanted you to know that that was my intention, even if you knew all of that, it's not entirely obvious that you owe it to me to give me your attention. Contrast that with a case in which I try to get your attention by calling your name and you ignore me. There, if under ordinary circumstances I call your name and you ignore me, it seems as though you've done me a wrong. I was trying to get your attention and you're simply ignoring me. If we're going to get at this difference, why is it that in the case where I drive by you in my fancy car and you ignore me, you haven't really wronged me at all? But in the case where I call you by name and you ignore me, you have wronged me. In order to get at that difference, I want to suggest that in the case where I call you by name, I give you a reason. I give you a kind of reason that's absent in the case where I drive my car by you. What we need to do is get at the nature of that reason. And here we can look at the second claim that I'm making. Second claim that I'm making, second thesis about address, is that the reasons that are generated by addresses are underwritten by the abiding mutual interest that rational social creatures have for cooperating and hence coordinating with other rational social creatures. So here's a way of thinking about it. I want to suggest that the normativity of address derives from the cognitive mutuality of the act of addressing someone in contexts of face-to-face verbal communication. This cognitive mutuality, I think, is characteristic of second personal relations that hold between people. The idea that there's a mutuality between you and me when we engage in these kinds of activities with one another, that is what makes this whole phenomenon a second personal one. And I'm going to try to convince you of this. My suggestion then is that we can account for the normativity of address, as it were, for the normative demands on the speaker and the normative demands on the audience. We can account for all of this in terms of what is mutually manifest between the speaker and the addressee in acts of address. When I use the term mutually manifest, that's my way of using something like the term common knowledge without having anything epistemic involved. It's not a matter of what you know, it's a matter of what is available to all of us. And it's available that it's available to all of us. So the idea is the normativity of address is to be understood in terms of things that are available to all of us, and we're aware that these things are available to all of us when a speaker addresses an audience. So then we ask, what exactly is mutually manifest when an active address is made, when a speaker addresses an audience? Well, first, the speaker's targeted attention capturing aim. Everyone knows that the speaker is aiming to capture the attention of the target. Everyone also knows that the speaker's intention is to initiate a possibly minimal joint or cooperative action with the target. This comes from the psychologist Herb Clark in a very influential and important book called Using Language. Clark might point out the following, that if I call you by name and you give me your attention and then I do nothing, I just walk away, that I seem to have done something wrong. And I seem to have done something wrong precisely because in addressing you, I've led you to expect that I'm going to propose something. That something might be as simple as just, I'm acknowledging you, as when I wave to you, and I'd like you to wave back to me to acknowledge me. Or it might be as complicated as proposing that we go out to dinner tonight. In any case, it's manifest to everyone that if I've addressed you, then you and everyone else can expect that I'm going to propose to initiate a joint or cooperative action with you. In addition, when we address one another with speech acts, not only are those two things common knowledge, or if you like, mutually manifest, but so too all of the features of the speech act whose recognition is a matter of competence with the language. So when I address you by saying, hey, Andre, do you want to go out to dinner tonight? Then I've addressed Andre in such a way that he knows that what I'm doing here is I'm intending to engage him in what Shauna Schifrin calls bilateral communicative relations. I love that term. The idea is that when I say, hey, Andre, do you want to go to dinner tonight? Everyone knows that now I am proposing to him that he and I engage in bilateral communicative relations, that we have, to use a fancy term, I'm proposing that he and I have a short conversation. That's part of what I'm doing when I'm addressing him in that fashion. All of this is obvious to everyone who ever observes an active address. Now, what I want to suggest is that if you take all those materials, the materials that are obvious to all of us when we see an active address, we can use those materials to account for the normativity of address. And we can do so as follows. When another rational being makes manifest that she's attempting to capture your attention and thereby to initiate a possibly minimal joint or cooperative action with you, and when she does all of that by performing an act with that public significance, the public significance of an address, I want to suggest that her attempt to initiate a joint or cooperative action with you ought to be acknowledged. That's the key point. If I can establish that you ought to acknowledge her attempt, then I have established that you are under some pressure to give her your attention, that she has given you a strong reason to give her your attention. That's what I want to try to establish, and I'm going to suggest that the failure to acknowledge her attempt is a kind of disrespect of rational agents who are also social in nature. This is my claim. I have to give you an argument for this claim. Here is how I want to argue for it. And you'll forgive me, this is somewhat schematic, this argument. As social agents, we must cooperate. To cooperate, we have to coordinate. To coordinate, we have to have some way of capturing and retaining another's attention. It thus follows that every social agent has an abiding interest in having some way to capture and retain others' attention. That's something that we value. Not only do we value this to a very great extent. Imagine living in a world in which you could never capture and retain another creature's attention. That is a horrifying world. And to the extent that that world is horrifying, to just that extent, we deeply value having some way to capture and retain others' attention. Now, insofar as I'm right about this, that every social agent has an abiding interest in the capture and retention of others' attention, I want to suggest that this aspect of our social lives, the capture and retention of another's attention, must not be left to chance and ability. Rather, it should be part of the repertoire of every rational social agent whatsoever. That is, this aspect of our social lives is such that speakers need a way to generate a reason for another agent to attend to, her. And that reason is one that has to be sufficiently weighty that it can't be outweighed merely by the other person's desire to ignore one. That is, the idea is, if as social rational agents we have a strong and lasting interest in capturing and retaining each other's attention, otherwise there's no way we're going to cooperate with one another, then it must be the case that that value is somehow connected to the acts that we perform in our attempt to capture other people's attention when we are proposing to cooperate with them. And all of that, I'm suggesting, is what underwrites the hypothesis that acts of address generate a reason for another person to attend to you. In short, the address is the tool that we use when we want to make another's attention something that is owed to us. Not something that we just happen to capture, but something that is owed to us. The address makes attention of another something that is owed to you. It generates a reason that's sufficiently weighty that they have that strong reason to give you their attention. What is it exactly that's owed when an act of address is directed at you? Well, the way I'm going to put it is that when a speaker addresses you, she has a defeasible claim on your attention, sufficient to enable you to discern the nature of the joint action she's intending to initiate. So it's not like when I address you, you owe me your attention for 15 minutes. When I address you, you owe me your attention just so long as it takes for you to discern what my proposed interaction with you is going to be. And if I can't get that out quickly, then I lose the entitlement to your attention. So I'm going to skip that and go on to the next idea, the idea of the presumption of cooperation. So the picture I've got going is this. As social rational creatures, we have a strong need to engage one another, to cooperate with one another, but to do so we need a way of signaling that we want one another's attention. And given the importance of attention capture, we want to make this something that's not, as it were, something that we happen to manage to do, but something that is owed to us. And that's what underwrites the reason that is generated when I address you. I generate a reason for you to attend to me. I want to suggest that when I do that, I am to be presumed cooperative, or when any speaker addresses you, she is to be presumed cooperative. And here's the idea behind this. A speaker who addresses you has a defeasible claim on your attention. That's what I just tried to argue. This claim has its source in the requirements for cooperation. We have to have a way to secure the attention of others as something that's owed to us if we're going to coordinate with them. But insofar as this claim on your attention rests on the assumption of the speaker's cooperativity, it's because you're presuming that she's cooperative that you owe her your attention. That claim on your attention is defeated when you have adequate reasons for suspicion regarding her cooperativity. That is, if you have reasons to think that yes, she's listening to you, but no, she's not doing so in the spirit of cooperation, then that defeats her claim on your attention. I want to suggest that in advance of any evidence, we should presume that a speaker is cooperative. That is, cooperativity is not something that you need evidence for. It is the default setting in which we engage one another. It should be the default setting in which we engage one another. Why is that? Because without such a presumption, coordination and cooperation will be practically very difficult, if not outright impossible. So the idea then is that the presumption of cooperativity is in place in order to ensure that we can fulfill the conditions in order to cooperate with one another. What about the defeat of the presumption of cooperativity? Well, there are various circumstances that do defeat the presumption of cooperativity, or at least appear to defeat the presumption. And these appear to call into question the claim on your attention. What kind of circumstances are circumstances in which an address is made, but we have reasons to think that the speaker is not being cooperative? Well, imagine high demand cases. Everyone addresses you and wants your attention at the same time. If you are a person of fame, if you have fame, if you're famous, you probably have dealt with this kind of circumstance. Clearly, if you are in a room full of hundreds of people, all of whom want your attention, you can't give it to all of them. So that would defeat the presumption of cooperativity. No one can reasonably suppose that you could cooperate with those hundreds of people, all of whom are shouting for your attention at once. There are all sorts of inappropriate contexts where addresses are made. For example, when you see that someone is already otherwise occupied, that's a good example of a case where you shouldn't address them. If you address them, you're addressing them in an inappropriate context. And it's far from obvious that if you address them in that way, they owe you their attention. There are addresses that are out of turn in a regulated speech exchange. If in the course of a courtroom episode, of a legal trial, I all of a sudden, who may be on trial, I look up at the judge and I say to the judge, "Oh, hey judge, I'd like to know if you'd like to go out to grab lunch after this trial is over." That address seems out of turn. And when I address the judge in that way, it's not obvious that I owe the judge, that the judge owes me his attention. Instead, he might just scold me and he might give me his attention, but scold me and tell me that I should not have done that. There are cases of bad track record. We all know the young child who constantly demands your attention by saying, "Daddy, mommy, mommy, daddy," all the time. You can ask whether that child always is deserving of your attention. We'll come back to this case. There's the case of the incompetent address. Some of us have friends that address us just in weird ways and at inopportune times. It's not obvious that we actually owe them our attention when they do so. There are questionable motives. People address us out of questionable motives. There might be addresses made out of narrowly commercial intentions. When you go to a car lot, the car salesperson will probably come up to you very quickly and address you. And his or her interest or their interest is narrowly commercial, and you might wonder whether, under those circumstances, you owe them your attention. Not clear. There are addresses that are made after the addressee indicates her lack of desire to engage. This happens regularly on international flights that you and I happen to be on, when you're seated next to someone who won't stop talking to you. That is extremely annoying, and it's not obvious that when that annoying seatmate talks to you, you owe her or him, unfortunately it's usually a him, your attention that whole time. There are addresses that are made out of evil intentions. I won't go into details here, but if you're interested, I can talk about those. And then there are catcalls. These are cases where men will address women on the street in very public settings by addressing them in very sexualized ways. These are also addresses, but it is far from clear that when a woman is addressed like this, she owes the man her attention. On the contrary, I would argue that because these are so obviously uncooperative, the woman does not owe the man her attention at all. The presumption of cooperativity has been defeated, and there is no reason to attend that has been generated. Now, I want to distinguish here between two types of cases. Here, I'm following a number of people in the ethics literature cases in which the active address was merely misused, and cases in which it was abused. It's merely misused if there is no bad intentions on the part of the speaker. Your friend who's oblivious to you, and who addresses you at inopportune moments, if he is the sort of person who's just oblivious, he has no bad intentions, then he's merely misusing the act of address, whereas the person who catcalls women on the street is abusing the act of address. There, the intentions are not at all cooperative. And I want to suggest that it's only in the latter where there's a lack of cooperativity. And it's only in the latter where the presumption of cooperativity is fully defeated. That's what I want to suggest. And with this in mind, I want to consider one more type of case. Imagine a case where you're fixing something in your house. I come up to you, I address you. It's clear that you're working on something. Do you owe me your attention right then and there while you're working on something in your house? On the contrary, I think there are cases in which your reasons not to give me your attention can outweigh the reason I've given you to attend to me. And in this kind of case, since I should have anticipated that in advance, I think you're entitled to postpone responding to my address, but not to cancel my claim on your attention. You can postpone responding to me, but I think even in that kind of case, ultimately you do owe some sort of response to give me some of your attention. Now, this is the final section of the paper. And here I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly because I'm going to give you a number of cases that if you're interested in them, you can tell me that you're interested in them and we can talk about them in the Q&A. I want to talk about the explanatory power of this theory. I'm going to suggest that my proposed model, my model in which addresses generate reasons for people to give you their attention, where those reasons reflect the value that we place on cooperativity with one another, and where those reasons are generated when the speaker is cooperative, where we should presume that speakers are cooperative, but where there are cases where that presumption is defeated. I want to suggest that this model can explain lots of things. First, it can explain the phenomenon of feeling put upon when another person addresses you in an attempt to engage you in conversation when you're not interested in doing so. Again, I'm not going to go into details here unless you ask me to do so in the Q&A. Second, I'm going to suggest that my model can explain an important asymmetry that exists between cases involving speech acts which initiate a speech exchange and those that merely extend an already ongoing speech exchange. Both kinds of acts may well be addressed to people, but there's a very different situation if you haven't yet entered into a conversation with someone than if you're already in a conversation. There are very different expectations, and I think my theory can explain the difference. Third, I think my theory can explain the existence of elaborate norms in the circumstances and manner of address in cultures that place great emphasis on social hierarchies. So I've suggested that the act of address is something that's common to all of us. Any one of us can use that act to lay claim on another person's attention. Many of you will know that there are many communities in which you can't just walk up to any old person and address them on the street. For example, in the UK, it would be highly improper for you or me to walk up to the Queen and address her by name. What I think is that we can explain why there are all sorts of elaborate norms, social norms, on top of the norms that I've described in talking about these cases where the cultural norms on address are more stringent than what I've suggested. I think my proposed model can also explain the existence of elaborate nonverbal practices where two individuals not previously known to each other try to signal their interest or lack of interest in initiating a conversation whose purpose is not narrowly practical. This is the bar scene, when you're sitting at a bar, you're by yourself, you want to strike up a conversation, but you don't know if the other person is as interested as you are in striking up a conversation. There are all sorts of elaborate nonverbal ways we have of signaling our interest to one another. And I think my model can explain why these very elaborate nonverbal practices have evolved in the first place. I think the model can also explain how considerations of politeness place some constraints on initiating a conversation with someone who's not known to you. I think the model can also explain the awfulness of the kind of conversational obliviousness of someone who's trying to strike up a conversation with you when you don't want to. We can explain what's awful about that kind of obliviousness in terms of this model of address. We can also explain the potential to be placed in what I would call a morally compromised position by people who address you in the course of asking for money on the street. It's an awkward situation to be in because you seem to have to do one of three things. Either you give the person money or food. Food is I guess the preferred thing to give, or you take up their address and tell them you're not going to give them anything. That's awkward because they're asking for help and you're saying no, or you ignore them altogether, and that's also doing something wrong. So it looks like our model would predict that when there are these kinds of exchanges on the street, the person who is being asked for help is in a situation where either you're going to give some kind of help or you're going to do something that is, at least to some extent, bad or not the good thing to do. And then finally, I think the model can explain what I'm calling the moral ugliness and the links between speaker and audience-directed snubbing. Snubbing being the phenomenon where when I address you, you ignore me, you've snubbed me. Or as a speaker, I can snub you when I address you and you give me your attention and then I walk away. That's my having snubbed you by way of an address. And I think my model can explain the moral ugliness of both of those kinds of snubbing. So let's review. Address is an act with a distinctive second personal public significance. A proper account of this act will be thoroughly normative. We'll talk about the norms that are involved. My own preferred account, it's normative. It involves four main claims. First, by addressing you, a speaker gives you a reason to give your attention to them. Second, that reason is underwritten by the abiding mutual interest that rational social creatures have for cooperating and hence coordinating with one another. Third, a speaker who addresses you enjoys a defeasible presumption of cooperativity. And fourth, this presumption can be defeated, and when it is, the speaker has no claim on your attention. Finally, such an account, this sort of model, has, I want to think, great explanatory power. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for your attention.
Very good, great talk, Sandy. Thank you so much. Are you disposed to answer some questions?
Sure.
Okay. Marco Aurelio, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting, really.
Thank you.
I'm thinking of autistic people. They seem to fail to engage properly or to be sensitive to the relevant reasons. The kind of reason you're talking about. I mean, the invitation to engage in the cooperative interaction, they fail to respond to that properly. So they feel somehow insensitive to these reasons. And in your talk, you said something about this natural basis it's very much like this cooperative pull that we feel just because we are these social animals we are. So I think the deficit that we find in autism might be exactly the kind of natural thing that leads us to be sensitive to these roles. So what do you think about that? I mean, that was something just crossed my mind as you talked.
So thank you very much, Marco, for that. I should preface what I'm going to say by saying that I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert on autism, nor do I know all that much about it. But what I would say is, so that is to say, if I say anything where there is good empirical evidence to show that I'm wrong, you should trust the evidence, not me. What I'd say is, I think autism may well be a manifestation of a kind of insensitivity to the things that I'm talking about. This would be one face of the autistic person's challenge, that they're just not sensitive to these reasons. I think that's an interesting hypothesis. I would want to see whether the empirical facts line up as we would predict if this is true, but I think you're absolutely right. That is one face of this phenomenon. Very interesting speculation.
Okay, Ernesto.
Oh, thank you for the talk. I have two related questions. So the first question is, what do your account add to a Gricean account? And the second question is concerning reasons. There are lots of research on the ontogeny and the phylogeny of cooperative actions by people like Tomasello or Speber, people like that. And it seems to me that those guys, as opposed to a Gricean very, very rational account, they have a much less a deflated account of the origin of the commitments that lead us to have to engage in conversations and joint actions in general. And I think they might say, for instance, someone in the relevance theoretic approach, or Tomasello's approach, or other people who work beyond Gricean's account, so to say, they wouldn't say that we have reasons to do it, but I think they maybe give a more deflated account, saying that we have just a pull to cooperate, or we are motivated to cooperate, as opposed to great apes that are not motivated to cooperate, and have migrating abilities that are part of our motivates us and allows us to engage in this sort of cooperative actions, as opposed to great apes, for instance. And there are also an ontogeny of those kind of things. And all these kinds of explanations seem to suggest a less rationalist account, in opposition to Gricean account that is not empirical. It's a purely reconstruction of what the rational agent might do. And that's what your account, that's why I think your account is great, especially when you get to more sophisticated interactions that you mentioned at the end of your talk. But for as concerned about the basis of the account, I would be maybe a little bit more skeptical about this your account. And Marco's question, for instance, concerning autistic people in the autismic spectrum, there are lots and lots of research how they engage and not engage in this sort of joint activities. So how do you account talk with this say the relevance theoretic approach, or Gricean approach, or Tomasello's approach?
So Ernesto, I want to thank you for your question, and also say you are absolutely correct to be somewhat skeptical on this point. So let me see if I can, I'm going to try to be as friendly as I can to your comment, because I actually am very sympathetic, even as it puts pressure on my view. So let me see if I can tell you why here's the way in which, so your first question was, what am I doing that Grice didn't do? And the answer is, well, I don't remember Grice having talked about address per se. What I'm doing is I'm basically taking a broadly Gricean approach to address. So you can call this broadly Gricean. You rightly point out that many people, not just relevance theorists, but also people who are worried about the over-rationalistic aspect of Grice, have criticized Grice for being overly intellectualist. I share that worry. And so what I want to tell you is there's one thing that I need that Grice gives me that I don't think I get from Tomasello or any of the relevance theorists are a middle case, but I don't think I get this from Tomasello. Certainly not the work with the monkeys and the great apes. What I need is a reason. So in that sense, I am committed to the intellectualist tradition, and I'll tell you why I need a reason. It's because one of the things that Tomasello does give you, namely a disposition to cooperate, motives to cooperate, doesn't yet predict anything like the reactive attitudes that we have when you don't respond to someone's addressing you. What I'm trying to get at, what I think is so interesting to me, is that this is a natural phenomenon, but it's a natural phenomenon that deeply engages our reactive attitudes. And I'm trying to understand why that is, in the thought that if I can understand why that is, it will get at part of what it is that we value about second personal relations to one another. So I need reasons. I'm worried that Tomasello doesn't give me reasons, and that's one of the reasons that I go in for Grice. That said, sorry I'm so wordy. That said, I share your worry. I share your worry about Grice. My colleague at the University of Connecticut, Mitch Green, has done some great work on criticizing Gricean intellectualism, trying to give a less intellectualist account of all these things. If we can have such an account that gives me the reasons that I want, I'm all for it.
Just a short remark. Tomasello give you normative expectations from the ontogeny of normative expectations. I don't know if it amounts to reasons, but I think he has some works with his team about how the origin of normative expectations. That I think that's what you might want for work. If it will give you reasons or not, I don't know. I mean,
that's interesting. Could I pester you to send me an email or put in chat some references, because it may be that I've read it and forgot it, but I'd love to see it.
I can do it right away.
Great, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that.
All right, Diana, por favor.
Okay, thank you for the great talk, Sandy. I always learn a lot from you.
Oh, thank you, Diana.
So, and it's just a follow-up of the two questions from Ernesto and Marco, I think. One part of the question is if you think that there is some kind of normativity that is involved just in a diet. I mean, not in a social way, not distributed in all the society or the culture or whatever, but some kind of patterns which are proper of, I'm thinking about lovers or mother and daughter or whatever, where the expected response is different because of some kind of normativity that is in that relationship and not general. And if so, maybe that's a way of trying to answer what Ernesto and Marco were thinking, which is that maybe the first step for this kind of normativity in the way in which we react depends on dyadic relationships and then generalized to the whole society. And it is connected with with your example that I would like to listen a bit more about the non-linguistic cues that are involved in addressing the other or preparing the situation for addressing someone and being successful and all that. And because I think they are in a sense previous to the linguistic addressing to the other. And if so, maybe there is something, for example, that autistic people cannot do, which are those kind of non-linguistic stuff, not the social conventions.
Yeah, so Diana, thank you so much. This is great. What you're suggesting, and I appreciate your connecting this to the previous two questions. You're suggesting that when it comes to the evolution of these kinds of things, maybe we want to start first and foremost with these dyads between maybe a parent and a child. That strikes me as eminently plausible. I would love, so I haven't, I am not in a position where I can give an account of where these things come from. This is why Tomasello is, as Ernesto pointed out, so interesting to me, because that's precisely what he tries to do. So I want to say I would love to be able to accept any plausible account of how these things evolve, and I think your speculation is a very, very plausible one. Then we'd need a story, as you rightly pointed out, of how it blows up to the community as a whole. I also think you're right to think that these things had to have evolved from much simpler communication systems. So the burden is on me. And again, this is a point that you've nicely made, and I think Ernesto nicely made this. And this may even be, Marco, this may have been a point that Marco, you were trying to make as well. The burden is on me to make sure that whatever theory is the theory I endorse can be shown to have emerged from simpler communication systems. I haven't done that work, to be honest. I can't do that work because I don't have the expertise, but I think you're exactly right. I'd love to find somebody who's done this work and see whether or not my views can square.
We just I don't know how to say advertisement. we published a book this year with Tony Gomira about not exactly this, because we didn't focus on the case of addressing someone, but we tried to develop the idea that from this kind of second person interaction you can explain many things, and Tomasello is in the last chapter with normativity.
That's great. Could I ask you the same favor that I asked Ernesto? Would you put it in the chat, because I would love to see it. And Ernesto, just to say thank you, I see your thing. Diana, I'm looking forward to yours in chat as well. Thank you so much.
Very well. There is more questions.
There might be one in Q&A.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's a very long comment.
Would you like me to try to read it?
Very interesting talk. How do you understand the fact that new digital technologies are changing the dynamics of attention, so that getting someone's attention is a symmetric interaction in social media?
So this is really good. Yeah, I see it.
You got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I see it.
Okay.
I hope everyone has access to it, and I'm going to ask that everyone read it so that I don't have to read it. But Felipe's question is a really, really nice one. Felipe is worried, as I think all of us should be, and I say this as somebody who has a son who works for YouTube. He's worried, as all of us should be, about digital technologies and attention capture with digital technologies. It's been long known that the way that, for example, YouTube or Facebook captures and sustains our attention is by playing on our emotions, riling us up. We tend to look at Facebook longer or YouTube longer when we're riled up. And Felipe is worried about this, as he should be. Question, what should we say about these kinds of techniques of attention capture? And the suggestion that I want to make is that this is not novel, and I think it's independent of my talk today, but we do not owe attention to any of these things. These things don't generate the same kind of reasons for us to attend. If relevance theory is correct anywhere, it's correct with respect to Facebook and YouTube. It's only insofar as I regard it as relevant that I have any reason to attend to it at all. The problem is, and Felipe, this is where I think you are going with your worry, the problem is many of us take ourselves to have reasons to be attentive to things that are really bad for us and our community. And the only thing I want to say there is I think the burden is on those of us who are educators to make this clear to people. But Felipe, I worry with you on the same thing. I think this is a great worry to have.
There is another question by Victos Somavi de Souza Barros.
Shall I read? I'll read that one too. Yep.
Okay.
Sanford, if you can read it out loud, please. So we can
yes,
record it.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. It seems to me that it is the need for social cooperation that generates the reason that others have to pay attention to our addresses, and that the address is just the medium through which I signal my intention to initiate cooperation. If that's so, there are two potential problems. The age-old is-ought gap, from the need to cooperate and for attention to the ought that others should pay attention. And more to the point of your talk, it seems that the source of normativity is not in addresses themselves, but in the transition from need to ought described above. that is need to cooperate, to you ought to cooperate with me. So so Vitor is raising two problems, both coming back to the idea that it's the need for social cooperation that generates the reason. I want to say, first of all, Vitor, I think you're onto something really important. Here's what I want to grant to you, that the kinds of problems that affect, if you like, problems of cooperativity in general, the rationality of cooperativity, those are going to be problems that arise here as well. I regard that as a feature, not a bug, because if that's true, it suggests that I'm right to think that the demand for attention does derive from considerations of cooperativity. So that's a feature, not a bug. But I also want to challenge one thing that you said, which is that the need for social cooperation is what generates the reason. In one sense, that's true. But in another sense, I want to caution you about that, because it may well be that I have all sorts of needs to cooperate. The fact that I have all sorts of needs to cooperate with you right now, if you don't know about those needs, you don't have any reason to cooperate with me. So what the act of address does, and I think you did hit at this, is it signals my having those needs. And I think it's that act that puts you under what I would call normative pressure to respond. So whether this manages to get around the is-ought gap, I don't know. What I want to suggest is that I'm working in a tradition that tries to understand normativity in terms of reasons, which themselves reflect values. And if there is an is-ought gap here, that's the same kind of is-ought gap that we find in other places. If all I've established is that the same is-ought problem arises here as it arises elsewhere, I'd be happy with that. I mean, my hope is that you can address that, but that's a big problem that I think is a problem for all of us, not just for my account, if that makes sense. So I guess I'm trying to say, even if your criticisms are right, what they would succeed in showing is that I have successfully located the source of the reasons for another person to attend, even as you are right that there are problems that I'm going to run into. So that's how I would like to respond to Vitor's comment. Thank you very much for that question. It's a really nice question.
Very well. Pedro Ramos.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Great talk. It's a simple question, I guess. I wonder if you could tell us about the extent to which the psychology of status can explain negative reactions to, mean attitudes regarding giving one his or her due attention in any failure, of communication, and someone calls someone's attention and is not well responded or whatnot. You're giving a lot of importance to the reactions caused by not receiving due attention. But you did not mention, I don't know if it's important to you in any way, the word status and all the psychological aspects involved. So if you could elaborate a little on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Pedro, thank you very much for that. The only gesture I made towards status, you're right about this. The only gesture that I made towards status was at the very end, when I said there are all sorts of communities where there are norms for who can address whom and when. Here's my thought. My thought is, start with the basic facts of address, wherein it's something that any one of us can do with any one of us. And then it's going to happen that, given the significance we associate with capturing another person's attention and having the right to it, we may well have social practices that build in even more rules on top of those basic rules. The way I want to think about status is as giving rise to social norms that are built on top of the norms that I'm talking about. So I remember the first time that I went to Germany when I was an assistant professor. This is a true story. I got myself in trouble because I was in an academic setting of a rather culturally conservative university, and I addressed a senior professor that I did not know. And I was told by a German friend of mine, you don't do that around here. So my thought is, in order to understand how that kind of thing evolves, start off with the basic case where we have this practice of address, build in on top of it certain social values like hierarchical values that you're talking about. And what you get as an output, I'd have to do more theorizing, but what you'd get as an output are further constraints on the norms of when you can address and whom you can address and where. So that's the way I'd want to look at this. Admittedly, that's not work that I have done, but it's work that I think could be done in the spirit of the proposal I made today. Does that address your question, Pedro?
Yeah, very much so. Just one little comment. It might be that status is a lot more basic than what you're suggesting, because it could be a status among two siblings. You know what I'm saying?
Good.
And the same household. So that's my point. It could be a very basic kind of response and a more widespread kind of phenomenon.
Excellent. So then I want the really quick counter response. I think you're right about that. Then I'd want to connect your point to the point Diana made, the nice point that she made, and say maybe the way to acknowledge that is to say that at the very beginning there are already status features marking the conditions on address. I could still maintain the mechanisms that generate the reasons, but I'd have to build in from the start rather than starting with, as it were, an abstract system where we can all do this with each other. I'd have to build in from the start that having a certain status entitles you to address certain people under certain circumstances. That would be a complication. It would be a complication I have not tried. It would be a minor change. It would be a change to the theory I'm offering. I think it would be a tweak rather than a major difference. But I appreciate that. I appreciate that point very much.
Marco?
Yeah, just a short follow-up on Pedro's comment, his last comment now, because I think his status is very, very basic in a sense. It's not like this on top of all that stuff. You have cultural rituals and, norms. And just think of apes, for instance. They have a lot of hierarchical, highly hierarchical structure, and actually the addresses among apes are sensitive to that. So I think that's something we share with primates in general.
Yeah, that's again a fair point. I'm going to give more thought to this, given the tenor of your comment, of Pedro's comment, and of Diana's comment, and several others. I'll give more thought to this. I do think I might want to build this in from the start rather than see this as built on top of something that's already, if you like, highly equitable. I may be showing my political ideology in my theorizing.
All right.
Just say, it might be just one little comment now.
Yeah.
Yes, it might be that this whole theorizing, which is great as a descriptive approach, but it sounds sort of liberal in its underlying assumptions. Which doesn't make it wrong in any respect, and not descriptively, especially. But yeah, there's still some idea of contract underlying it that I cannot help feeling.
Good. Yeah, this would not be the first time that I will have been accused of being somewhat naive and maybe even politically naive in theorizing. But okay, I appreciate these points very much. I think this is a productive way to be pushed, so I appreciate that.
Okay, Sandy, my question is about the presumption of cooperativity. In cases where it can be defeated. Suppose we are both working in the same firm, and looking at a very interesting promotion. So we are in a situation of competition. Each time we meet each other, our verbal interactions are made of indirect threat or menace or things like that. But it is our mutual interest to pay attention to these kind of stuff, because it is important for me to know what you are up to, and vice versa. Of course, in these cases, a promise usually as a preparatory condition that what the object of the promise is good for the hearer. In the case of a menace, it's just the opposite. But we pay attention to what we are saying to each other. And well, in a context where cooperativity does not seem to be the keynote. No. So in these cases, cases like that, the presumption of cooperativity is defeated or not?
That's a great question, Andre. That the way I want to think about it is, don't think about the fact that you and I are in a competitive situation doesn't automatically defeat the presumption of cooperativity, because consider a case like this. What I want to do is I want just to staple my papers together, and you have a stapler, and so it's no skin off your back. It will not adversely affect you at all. The thought is there. I should be able to say, hey, Andre, could you give me your stapler, and you should attend to me when I do that. So the thought is, insofar as if you're imagining a case where we are being competitive, we're competitive with one another, and I'm trying to get your attention so that you help me do what I want to do, not what you want to do. That could, in principle, be a case where where the presumption of cooperativity is defeated. I was imagining the case that I imagined under evil intentions was a case like that, where you know that I'm trying to get your attention because I'm trying to harm someone else, and you think that's a terrible thing and you don't want to do that. If you know that in advance, then you have a reason not to attend to me, even as I call you out. Hey, Andre, you can ignore me there. That you take a risk though, because if you're wrong, then you have done me a harm. But if you know that I'm calling you to participate in a harmful activity, I think that could be a defeat. That's going to be harmful to you as well. I think that is a case of defeat of presumption.
Okay, if there is no other question, I believe we can just thank you for that magnificent talk. I hope to see you around for the next 2 days. And thank you to all for your participation.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, and I look forward to participating over the next couple of days.
Okay, all right. So good night to all, and see you tomorrow.